Uh, Hello, everybody. This is Nick Bravulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews with contributors to the journal. Today, we're meeting with Hans Schildermans, who is the guest editor for a symposium that is entitled Pragmatism and the Art of the Possible. It's a very international group of contributors, and it really deals with two closely related themes. All the papers deal in one way or another with the present climate crisis and our ability or inability or failure to come to grips seriously with the really serious threats posed by climate change. But the theoretical background for the collection is a sort of European take on the very American tradition of American pragmatism, Dewey, Peirce, James in particular. And one of the things that's interesting about this collection, Linda Stone addresses this in her paper, is what she calls the third generation of pragmatist theory. The classical pragmatist authors, again, Dewey, James, and Peirce particularly, then sort of the rediscovery or reorientation of pragmatism, particularly by Richard Rorty in the 70s and 80s. And now what Stone calls a third generation of European theorists who have taken up pragmatism and these classic sources, but read through a distinctively European sensibility and specific authors like Isabel Stengers or Bruno Latour or others who take up the pragmatist mantle, but in a very different way. And it's the blending of the potential of this reconceptualized pragmatism and this urgent crisis of climate change that creates the occasion for this symposium. So with that background, Hans, thank you very much for joining us. Why don't you give us an overview of how you see the set and how you see the themes that I've laid out developing across the different papers?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the introduction, I think an important theme is indeed like how we deal with current discourses of education for sustainable development and how these often, in our reading at least, bear some kind of pedagogical optimism in them. And what we try to do in the different set of papers, so this is one of the main tensions that came about while we were discussing with the different contributors, was the idea of the tragic sense of education and how these often positive futures or probable futures can be balanced out with more with other kinds of futures and futures that maybe we cannot think of right in this moment. Mm-hmm. And it is there that we see pragmatism as an art of the possible, which we try to articulate throughout the set of papers, drawing on different authors and different traditional pragmatic texts.
Yeah, so that's very helpful as an overview. So how do we balance the very dire concerns about the consequences of climate change while not falling into the trap of skepticism or cynicism or fatalism? And what specifically does pragmatism have to contribute to that, what you call in the title, the art of the possible?
So I think one of the main issues we deal with, or what we find problematic in these discourses, is often the kind of global imaginations that take place behind them and the kind of heroist, often still very anthropocentric narratives about overcoming trouble, solving problems. And there, of course, there is a very strong connection with pragmatism traditionally conceived and the problem-solving pedagogies developed in the wake of the work of John Dewey, for instance. And via this rereading, we try to bring out other dimensions that balance out this very optimistic or this melioristic attitude within pragmatism with more nuanced accounts, more situated accounts that don't tell big stories about the salvation of mankind or the saving of the world, but rather how in very specific situations, when people come together in what Dewey perhaps could call communities of inquiry, but which get other connotations in the different papers, people grapple with these problems on a very, what Latour would call a very terrestrial level, instead of this kind of a global scale. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the main issues in the set of papers.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the themes that cuts across, I think, nearly all the papers is this reconception of the current moment as the Anthropocene era. Can you say a little bit about that term and why the authors use it and what it signifies for a particular way of thinking about this particular phase of we'll call it human evolution?
Yeah, so the term Anthropocene is also a term that we don't use completely unproblematized, or like we had also some discussions about should we use it and on what conditions can we use this term. It's coined by geologists to denote like a new phase in the evolution of the Earth or the development of the Earth, in which human beings themselves have become a kind of a force of nature, as you could say. It has become a bit of very fashionable to speak in terms of Anthropocene or to organize symposia about the Anthropocene. At the same time, a lot of authors have also questioned this term. For instance, Donna Haraway, another author upon which we draw in this set of papers, she suggests or she argues that actually Anthropocene still keeps the human being center stage in a kind of heroic narrative of overcoming the problems associated with the Anthropocene, such as climate change and the different crises that come with it. So we use the term, but then during the set of papers, and some papers more explicitly than others, we try to also problematize the term or to come up with alternatives for how we understand the role of human beings in the current situation and the role of educational practices.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a couple of times you've already mentioned the idea of invoking a particular theory or theoretical concept, using it, but at the same time, sort of deconstructing it or questioning it. How does that work to maintain both those levels of discussion within one coherent narrative?
Yeah, so often what in several papers has occurred is that we take a particular text from the pragmatic canon, for instance, a text by John Dewey, and then try to read it and try to not so much try to criticize it, because a lot of these texts have been criticized for different reasons, but rather in conjunction with other authors, often European authors that come from more French or post-structuralist backgrounds, like for instance Bruno Latour or Isabelle Stengers, try to shed new light on these traditional pragmatic concepts, and in that way to destabilize, in a sense, the kind of meliorism and the kind of humanism that's still present in those. So in that way, we try to open up different perspectives on these traditional texts. So we don't claim that we want to defend them. At the same time, we also don't only criticize them, but we try to draw out another pattern. That's kind of a way of patterning and drawing out different patterns from these texts.
Yeah, that's great. So let me just build on that point. So one of the things that's interesting to me about this project is that I think of pragmatism as, in many ways, a very American mode of philosophy. As you say, the meliorism, the belief of progress, the optimism, particularly in Dewey, maybe somewhat less so with some other authors. What happens as that American philosophy gets exported or imported into a more European sensibility? And how do you see the notion of pragmatism and, again, the art of the possible shifting as it moves into this, slightly different way of invoking the notion of pragmatism?
Yeah, so I think the idea that pragmatism is in itself a very American philosophy is a particular construction that has taken place after the fact. And that's actually and that's also a point I think that Linda Stone develops in her paper, that there was a lot of exchange between different pragmatic authors and their European colleagues. I think, for instance,
even then.
Yeah, even then.
Right.
I think, for instance, about the connection between William James and Bergson in France. I think nowadays, when we try to re-articulate what that actually means possible, I think here it's very important to bear in mind the distinction made by Isabelle Stengers, namely between the probable and the possible. And in our understanding, a lot of traditional pragmatic texts, for instance, the work of Dewey, falls within the logic of the probable or probable solutions, desirable solutions. And in that sense, do not really open possibility or like possibility in a radical sense. It's radical newness. This kind of dimension that we try to bring in via this rereading that we undertake in the different papers, and by bringing them into conversation with other scholars.
That's great. Thank you, Hans. Why don't you tell us the names of the different contributors to the set? We don't have time to go through all the papers individually, but just to tell us who the authors are and where they come from.
So the first paper is by Linda Stone, who is a professor emerita at UNC in the USA. The second paper is written by Stefano Oliverio from University of Naples in Italy. The third paper is from me, from University of Vienna in Austria. Then follows a paper by Joris Vliege from KU Leuven in Belgium, and one from Bianca Toillier from Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain. And the last two papers are by Martin Safransky from Goldsmiths, University of London in the UK, and Petra Mikulan from UBC in Canada.
Yeah, outstanding. Hans, thank you for putting this set together. I think it's a really fascinating and really theoretically important exploration of issues. You've given a great summary and overview, and I encourage people to look at the set, look at the individual papers. I think it's really an important contribution to the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this conversation.
Okay.